Good day, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I hope everyone was able to get out and take part in celebrations for Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday. I'd like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. Today's webinar is focused on economic reconciliation within the agriculture sector. Protein Industries Canada has implemented a requirement for an economic reconciliation plan for all technology projects in our second round of funding. Economic reconciliation approaches differ by organization, and we are happy to be able to provide a forum for attendees to learn more about economic reconciliation from our two speakers. We'll take questions once both speakers are finished, and you can submit your questions through the chat in the call. So our first speaker is Shaun Soonias. He's the Director, Indigenous Relations with Farm Credit Canada and is a proud member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, located in Treaty 6 territory west of the Battlefords. Shaun has 29 years of experience in social and economic development, having held senior positions with all orders of government, nonprofits, and an independent office of the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly. Shaun is passionate about agriculture and what this sector means to Indigenous economic development and what Indigenous involvement means to this sector, and the resiliency and well-being of Canada's economy. Our second speaker is Chris Googoo, and he's a proud member of the Wagimaw First Nation, living in Millbrook on the unceded territory of Mi'kma'ki with his wife and 3 children. Chris is the Chief Operating Officer of Ulnooweg and the Executive Director of the Ulnooweg Indigenous Communities Foundation, working to strengthen the relationship between Canada's philanthropic sector and Indigenous communities. Chris started at Ulnooweg in 2000, and he's been with the organization for over 23 years now as the most senior person. His most recent works have been involved in the creation and implementation of the new National Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, implementation of Ulnooweg Education Center's STEAM-based education under the Science and Innovation Program, and the recent acquisition of 200 acres of old-growth forest land, a Cedalus formerly known as Windhorse Farm, focused on creating a space for healing and education. At this point, I'll introduce Shaun Soonias, who will be our first speaker. Over to you, Shaun.
Thank you very much, David. I'll just get my screen sharing here, make sure I got the right thing. Got to put the specs on. Right. All right, can I just confirm that you can see that? Okay, perfect. All right. Thanks for having both Chris and I today. I think we're both super excited to start to engage and share more with the broader industry and sector, what it means to work and engage with First Nations, Métis Inuit across Canada in the ag and food space. I'm going to, the couple of slides I have are really about contextualizing where we're coming from, where we've been, where we're going, and we'll get into a little bit about what that can look like when it comes to implementing different kind of practices or actions from your company or organization. So when we look at Indigenous people and where we're coming from, this is where we're coming from. There's a lot of poverty, but it's not who we are or were or ever chose to be as Indigenous people. Move forward, this history, I think will be something that we can celebrate where we've come from. But for the most part, I think people don't understand the level of poverty that a lot of our nations contend with, and how difficult that is to get involved with economic development when you don't have anything to back it up in terms of security or land. In a country where land equals wealth, First Nations in particular can't leverage up, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of acres would put them in a very rich asset base if they were off reserve, but on reserve, it really means nothing. So it's been a lot of work, between banks and First Nations and other regulatory bodies to look at how do we actually lend on reserve. And a lot of that has to do with comfort levels rather than actually policy or regulation. So, and just to share, what other leaders in the past have said, Chief Owen Mercury, former Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, he said this a number of years ago, and it always resonated with me, is our present is our responsibility, our past is our authority, and our future is our mandate. And a lot of that, of course, is driven around how we serve our communities, and in particular, our young people. And as we think about agriculture in Canada and the Americas and around the world, when we get down to it, it's important to understand that agriculture isn't something new to Indigenous peoples. This this slide here in the background is those dots kind of represent Indigenous agriculture according to the Stats Canada survey. So you can see there's a fair bit of agricultural involvement across Canada. I wouldn't say that it's proportional or at the rate a lot of our communities would like to be in, but it's still something that's carried on. And in the foreground, there's a list of some products and foods and things like that. It's definitely not exhaustive, but when we look at the contributions of Indigenous agriculture in the Americas, it's really something that's not well understood around the world, or certainly in Canada. And you'll notice ingredients and products on there that are actually used every day today. So, when we're looking at our favorite foods, 60% of the food on every table around the globe today comes from the Americas. At the time of contact, agriculture in the Americas was the most advanced engineered architectural agriculture in the planet. So we've got, from the Amazon to Alaska, we've got food forests, we've got planted forests, man-made soils, we've got all sorts of iterations and of corns and things like many generational modifications across a variety of foods and seeds and so forth. We've got, if we look at today, what if things were off that list, like that show that, shows what would the world look like without France. If the world looked something different without Indigenous people, our dinner tables would look drastically different. In Italy, you wouldn't have your pizzas, your pastas, because you wouldn't have the tomatoes for your sauces. Or great Asian cuisines with that spice levels, you would not have those, because the peppers that go into those ingredients wouldn't be available. We wouldn't have the rubber for our tires to drive to the cars to go to a pub. And if we were tired and not feeling well the next day, there'd be no acetaminophen to make us feel better, because those come from birch bark. So you can see from that list, and probably a lot more, that Indigenous people have always been involved with agriculture and trade amongst ourselves internationally and globally. So that's something that I'm very excited to see as we open up the toolbox, the resources, those connections and intersections for growth for our communities, what that might look like. And I'm excited, because I think about innovation and creativity based on our historical and ongoing participation in agriculture. Once some of the limits and barriers are removed, I think we'll start to see a lot more innovation and creativity. And just going as well to look at some of the knowledge. And when I think about innovation and creativity, a lot of folks will hear our communities reference North America's Turtle Island and things of that nature. And there's a creation story about that. I would suggest people kind of Google that. There's a different iterations of it, but at the end of the day, Turtle Island is, it's real. It is a turtle. And when we look at the types of knowledge that is required to know that the Americas looks like a turtle, I'm not sure what that means, but that's something in our creation stories, and it goes back many generations. So I'm excited to look at when we have this kind of Indigenous knowledge, connection to the land and water, the roles and responsibilities our people see for ourselves in terms of being stewards of the land and so forth. I think the space is really exciting. So I joined FCC a number of years ago. I'd spent much of my career in the social side of things. And when I arrived at FCC, and our corporate offices are located in Treaty 4 territory in Regina and homeland of the Métis, we hadn't really been in Indigenous lending. It wasn't that we couldn't do it, but we didn't really have much experience. We didn't have anything intentional about it. We didn't have anything special about how we conducted business reviewed, our policies, our eligibility criteria, things of those nature. So we really didn't have much engagement or contact with Indigenous agriculture and food. So when we look at the mission that we're setting out to accomplish here, it's really about addressing some of those key barriers that our nations and communities face, either as communities or individual entrepreneurs. And it's around access to capacity. And one thing that we know is that our communities and nations have been involved in agriculture for many thousands of years. When we look at the treaties out west in particular, those treaties were a transition from bison culture to agriculture. And they had all sorts of articles within Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 and others around agricultural supports, education, tools, and things of that nature. And a lot of our nations did great. They were doing a great job of transitioning, ran successful agricultural businesses. And it got to the point where that was maybe too successful. And neighbors and so forth of our various First Nations didn't like the competition and lobbied government. And we saw that the Indian Act created a couple of processes called a passive permit system. So you needed a pass to leave the reservation and a permit to sell your goods, which probably most cases, neither of those were really, granted probably in meaningful ways. And when the dollars came in for that sale, it went to the Indian agent, not the individual farmer or community. So we can see under those circumstances and peasant farming, which limited our communities to, I guess, ancient technologies. So even though steam tractors and things were coming online, we had to use hose, like hand instruments. And we weren't allowed to collaborate. So Chris was next door to me on his farm. Our families could not work together to harvest, to work the land. It only can be our individual families on individual land. So under those circumstances, we saw the crest of Indigenous ag and food involvement probably peak maybe early in the 1900s, if not earlier in some ways, and it started that slow decline. So today, when we're looking at our communities who are really interested in getting back into the agricultural food sector, they are struggling with capacity. We don't have the generational knowledge that many farms do. That's goes from one generation to another. That farmyard that started getting built in the 1900s, that doesn't exist in our community. So we have to start from scratch on all your equipment, all your tools, all of the things that a farm would need. So there's some deficits there, and of course access to capital. The Indian Act has not served our nations well when it comes to economic development. That's gotten in the way. Most financial institutions who have traditionally, and in many ways, still do very little lending on reserve. There's a lack of comfort with it. As an Indigenous person, I've heard that in the past, like, oh, we don't lend on reserve. That's just the answer, and maybe nobody even knows why anymore. But we also know that there's lots of banks over there, like First Nations Bank of Canada, Peace Hills Trust, and others that have been lending into what was maybe considered riskier lending environments and having no problems. Their default rates are like any other bank, and they're able to grow that. So we're really challenging ourselves with trying to match our great services, our great products, our knowledge, our networks with what Indigenous peoples would need moving forward in the ag and food space. And what does that look like? Well, we know from research and engagements that FCC's had with folks across the country at various times that pretty much everyone wants to get back into it or stay into it or grow. Very few people are looking not to get into it or to reduce their operations. So we know that that's going to be an ongoing trajectory in the years to come. And I'll contextualize it with looking at other sectors and how they've advanced and what that will mean for Canada's agricultural sector. Other oil and gas, LNG, energy, those sectors, there's a lot of engagement, there's a lot of projects, there's a lot going on. Banks, the industry, and Indigenous people have been working on those projects for decades. They've found best practices. They're able to get these projects running and rolling and add a lot of value to communities. In that space, agriculture doesn't look, it's not quite at a point where our nations, our communities are turning their lens to, because there's other, maybe what would be considered low-hanging fruit and things that they want to monetize and create those capital projects around. But as our nations and folks start to turn their lens to agriculture, we need to be ready. And I'll stop sharing my presentation there. But in terms of what that looks like being ready, that can look like many different things. So my screen is stop sharing just to confirm. Okay, perfect. And what that can look like, for us at FCC, we have to really think hard about what we need to do differently. And part of that journey started with understanding our reconciliation story. And we can reference, truth and reconciliation calls to action. All companies, all organizations really should focus their efforts on looking at that document and the calls to action. But it's also important to look at your own history as an organization, as a company, and see, do you have a reconciliation story that you can attach and make your own? If you can do that, it becomes a bit more meaningful. Not to say that you shouldn't look at the TRC or that shouldn't resonate with folks, but I'll share FCC's reconciliation story. So when I first came to FCC, before I did my interview and knew much about FCC and studied, getting ready to try out for the job, the only thing I really knew from our oral history in our communities was that the position was FCC took land from Indigenous First Nations and provided that land to returning soldiers. And when we started to look deeper into that, it turned out to be true, maybe not the direct link that FCC was undertaking that process, but our leaders and what we were born out of did. So our first board chair was Brigadier General T.J. Rutherford, and he was responsible for operating the Veterans Lands Act and the Social Settlements Acts, which did take land from First Nations to give to returning soldiers. And I'll note that wasn't provided to our First Nations veterans. That's something that continues to be fought for today in many ways. And I'll also point out that our First Nations volunteered, not subject to conscription, but volunteered for military duty at much higher rates than Canadians did at the time. And that's something that our nations are still proud of today, when at that time, we weren't citizens. We weren't allowed off the reserve. We weren't allowed to do anything in many ways, but still defended the country. So we're still looking at how those things are reconciled as well. But when we think about economic reconciliation, that takes a number of different faces that we can look at. That can be looking at your procurement practices of your companies, trying to identify the kind of markets and companies that are in your area or within those vendors that provide products and services to your companies. Consider what you can do to transition to Indigenous in a meaningful way. So when we look at Canada's call for, say, 5% procurement, what's your province's Indigenous population? So if I look at Saskatchewan, it might be 17, 20%. Well, why wouldn't we look at more 17 to 20% procurement or more to get that parity that's needed? And we've had Cabinet Delorme come out and meet with our staff. And one of the things that resonates with us from his comments was that we've inherited this. Like, nobody really alive on this call created residential schools or the 60 scoop or the different regulations with the Indian Act that's impacting our communities in such negative ways. But we do have the responsibility, knowing about them, to address them. And whether you consider economic or not, that's reconciliation, is taking action, understanding some of the truths that need to be understood in order to have and rebuild that trust in the relationships that exist or don't exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are very important. The other thing is, like, one of the things that we've done is, and it would be slower going, but like we're starting to add Indigenous offices. So, Chris's organization, Ulnooweg, they've got buildings in Millbrook. The First Nation has buildings, office buildings that FCC now is operating on in Millbrook First Nation, and we're building out to grand opening for that. So we're super proud of that. But those are the types of things that needs to be done more. And when I look at that, it's not always identifying what, but the how. So whatever you're doing, if it's summer students, then it's summer students. And I would look at something like FCC. I could say, well, for the first 60 years, I'm pretty sure we didn't have a lot of diversity in our summer students. What does the need look like for the next 60 to change that dynamic, or the next 10? So at corporate offices, we're intentional about 100% of our summer students are diverse, and half of those are Indigenous. And we've gone even a little bit further in creating some great relationships with one of the community-based schools here in Regina in high and grade 11 and 12 students, to get that education and experience in an organization that maybe they would never picture themselves being in. When a young person walks downtown Regina and you see the office buildings with all the smoke glass, you have no idea what goes on behind those windows. But you get them in here, and they're contributing almost more to us than we are to them. They're doing a great job at educating our leaders and the folks that they're working with about the experiences and priorities of the community, and those touch points mean everything. And no matter how small or big that reconciliation that you're looking to undertake, that young person might work here a year or two as a summer student, and then maybe go into university when they would not have thought of it otherwise, and come back for a few years and work for us, and perhaps stay on and work their career or go somewhere else. But the point is, they got an education, they're starting to work somewhere else, they're seeing things they might not have otherwise seen, and at the same times I mentioned, doing more for our staff and learning what they can do differently. So another thing in economic reconciliation is, I think data is important. So one of the struggles at FCC, and I know many other corporations, banks in Canada have, is if you don't know who your customers are, if you can't identify who's Indigenous, how can you serve them? How can we add value to that? And that's something that we've built out over the last couple of years, is actually our self-declaration process, which allows us to understand who's doing what where, and how much are they borrowing, what are their needs, what sectors are they involved with, and most importantly, how can we use that data to give back to the community? Because anyone on this call, if you're familiar with these Indigenous experiences, our communities are studied like endlessly. You want to know how many kids under the age of 5 have had an ear infection? That number is tangible, and you reach out and figure that out. You want to figure out how many Indigenous farms are? Good luck with that. It's very little data. So we're trying to build that out, work with other stakeholders, and share what those needs are, and hopefully be able to assemble some things that our nations can use to make informed decisions, as well as ourselves. Any organization, you can't take shots at in the dark to do some of that stuff. So I've talked long enough. I'll pass the baton over to Chris.
Thanks, Shaun. Very insightful. I think you've given folks a lot to think about, for sure, and with some good points, especially on the access to capital and then the data portion. I know those two things come up in conversation frequently on my end, and not surprised that that's a important part from your side. At this point, I'd like to welcome Chris Googoo, who is our second speaker. With Ulnooweg, Chris is not just focused on agriculture, but they do a lot of development and STEAM and education programming. So I think Chris brings a slightly wider perspective in that area than just agriculture. So I'll hand it over to Chris right now.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for participating today, and this beautiful day in Nova Scotia that we're under, but yeah, it's definitely a soaking that we've had in the past 2 weeks that was needed in this area, for sure. So as David mentioned, we're an Indigenous-led organization, and I've been with the organization for 23 years, and the organization's been around for 38 years. So what I'd actually like to do is maybe start on a little bit on the history of Ulnooweg, and I'll share my screen. you see my screen now? Okay, great. So basically what you're looking at is is our tagline, we believe in dreams. Like I said, 38 years organization. Back in 1984, as Shaun mentioned, one of the things that actually started Ulnooweg in discussion around meeting the capacity within the communities was the whole notion of the 60s group era and all those kids coming back to and finding their culture and language and reclaiming that. And so a number of gatherings within the community and some studies, as I pointed out, led to actually the development of Ulnooweg Development Group as a Aboriginal Capital Corporation during that time. And of course, in parallel, there was this about 15-20-year journey along the path as well, where the government was building a new relationship with the First Nations as well. And that meant moving a lot of the capital programs over to the Indigenous communities. And so our histories with the government and their programs kind of weaved in together. And we're just developed around the same time as these new programs came out. So when the government came out with, I think around $430 million at the time, Ulnooweg was one of those Aboriginal capital corporations that received funding. We started out basically delivering at the time to Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia population. And ever since then, we've grown to serve all Indigenous people in Atlantic Canada. So today, as you'll note there, we're basically given three broad mandates, how I view them. You're looking at providing the economic and social welfare of Indians there at the time, the language being used, education, research, and employment, and also providing supports within the philanthropic sector. So the first 15 years, Ulnooweg really focused on the lending side. We now actually manage the grant program that used to be called the Aboriginal Business Canada program. And that's we provide around $1.5–2 million in grants through that program. In our lending, we've done probably now $80–85 million since our start. And not much agriculture, to be honest, but a lot of fishery and a lot of kind of in the initial stages, community-based mom and pop stores, like stuff like that. So Ulnooweg Development Group is a not-for-profit organization, 38-year history. From then on, like after 15 years or so, around the same time when I came in to work for Ulnooweg back in 2000, we started really looking at Ulnooweg and the mission behind it and all the gaps within the communities. And of course, we went back to our mandate given to us by the community then, and trying to look at that and how we can actually fulfill that mandate. That actually led in the capital side, the development of what then was called the Ulnooweg Financial Education Center. The Financial Education Center was focused on basically number 1 and 2. We had a tool that we developed through our research in connection with the First Nations Finance Authority, what's called the Community Financial Review Process. And that's basically looking at audited statements of bands that could number from 100 to 300 pages and representing them to the First Nation governments in pictographs, so that you didn't need a financial background basically to look at them and review them. And we're really focused on the capacity of the communities to actually use their own source of revenues and access more capital net. And then it was accessing the First Nations Finance Authority capital. So as we're moving along here as well, around 2017 or so, we get into STEM education, and most of that really reflected back to the push for procurement at the time, actually, and the push for we started seeing more innovation, major projects in Atlantic Canada specifically. But we didn't see the capacity. And as Shaun mentioned, like the agricultural capacity, we saw the lack of capacity in the IT sector. So we didn't have the businesses with the IT background to bid on these procurement opportunities, nor even we have the IT capacity to meet the employment opportunities that were becoming available. So a number of us, basically two of us from the Ulnooweg organization were going into these circles of innovation with the academic institutions and the private sector, the venture capitals and all that stuff. And we weren't seeing any Indigenous people at all in those circles. We didn't see the educators. We didn't see the leadership in there. We didn't see the technical people. And when I mean technical, I mean like employment officers and the economic development officers as well, which was alarming to us, right? Because the opportunities back now almost 10 years, these were the jobs for the future that were coming in, the sectors of the future that were coming along. AI was just coming along, big data was just coming along, 3D tech model and all these things that were just coming along. So we intentionally went into this purpose, taking advantage of the government programs that were funded back then. CanCode was a big one, where Ulnooweg was able to get $1 million of the 50 million that went out actually. So we were able to build a STEAM program from that, and which then brought to us dropping the financial side and really focusing on number 2 there, which was developing and delivering courses and programs and training in STEAM. And that led to a number of partnerships, which I might tap into later, but that led to partnerships where we actually went out to the First Nation communities and delivered STEAM curriculum on top of what they were already being exposed to. So we were able to present to them these general topics on animation, again, 3D tech modeling, big data, robotics, that they probably never received in the public education, especially in the first education world as well. And as many of you might not know or may know, when you have initiatives that are out there that promote innovation and they focus within urban centers, you more than likely won't get First Nation, Inuit, or Métis populations going to these centers, because just either barriers of affordability, transportation, or even just not feeling invited into those circles as well, just from the history of Canada and the history of let alone our education system. So this stuff being new, also parents, uncles, and aunts did not necessarily see this as an important thing for our children to learn, while they were trying to reclaim our culture and language at the time as well, and they continually do as well. The next thing we developed was the Ulnooweg Indigenous Communities Foundation in 2018. And within 2 years, actually, we were very fortunate to land a major partnership with the Mastercard Foundation in that, where they provided a grant of $50 million over 5 years for us. So that really accelerated our development in terms of what we were able to do on the ground with children and young adults from an 18 to 35 level, so that we can build kind of those leadership qualities and build more capacity and open them up to more opportunities where they can actually travel to these centers or even support them while they were in university and college. The two purposes of our cooperation, of course, with the foundation are to act like a portal for our funds and advanced education by providing those scholarships and bursaries. So with I'm just going to skip through that. With the three entities there, we do have other areas of focus in there that you'll see. So as the Development Corporation, we've really focused on Indigenous entrepreneurship there, loan support and grants, as I mentioned. There's a cultural component in there as well, but it's really focused on our professional and personal development as an organization. So kind of Shaun jumped on some stuff where what are you doing as an organization, for example, to educate yourselves in an Indigenous space. As an Indigenous organization, this is a continuing development process for us. So as an organization, we did also reflect on ourselves and what we represented as an Indigenous organization, especially to our Indigenous employees. And that has led to internal programming where we bring in knowledge keepers and elders on a regular basis. Not I mean regular, I mean like 2 every 3 weeks. And they tell us about the history of our people, and they tell us about the knowledge that they have. And a lot of it is the when you're talking about basket makers, medicine people, and water people, water protectors, they bring a lot of science into those discussions. So our science innovation team listens very intently there and brings a lot of those discussions and points out, and we try and embed them into the curriculum that we developed and integrated with what's out there already, and are therefore validating our Indigenous knowledge into what's already in the textbooks today. Education center, as you'll see, focus on entrepreneurship, financial literacy. You'll see why we do that and how we mix the two, the 3 entities there: science innovation, healing, education. We purchased a 200-acre forest just recently, a year ago, which has a stand of old hemlock elders, which are pre-colonial. They're about 400 or 500 years old. I think we dated a mother maple. We call it grandmother maple there. The kids had a science retreat and dated that tree to 520 years old, I believe. So if you can imagine our kids being in that forest and imagining a time when it was pre-contact and what that looked like and what it looked like for our people, that's the imagery that we're trying to inspire in children, and valuing our knowledge as Indigenous people. And what we've shared, as Shaun's pointed out, 60% and up to 70% of agriculture comes from us as Indigenous people. And this is where we want to have those discussions with children in ensuring that they see the value of our people, and will continue to see the value of our input into society, and on and on and on. And on the Communities Foundation, as I mentioned, there's 4 areas where we try and harness like the potential of youth leaders, access to cultural language, providing meaningful educational pathways, and transition to employment and entrepreneurship. This is just a little history of Ulnooweg and our phases, how we've grown over the years. Fisheries was a big thing after the Marshall decision there, recognizing our treaty rights, where we now have a team of 10, I believe, experts in fishery. The rapid growth Ulnooweg had over the last 20 years, last 10 years, say. So in retrospect, for myself, 23 years, I remember a time when Ulnooweg had 5 employees, 1 being myself. And now we have an organization that is over 85 employees. So you can imagine the level of impact that now Ulnooweg has on its people, but more so the level of information and the level of knowledge that our youth that work for Ulnooweg today have, that they can then build on their leadership qualities and move those forward for our people. So little focus on science innovation. That's mainly what our science innovation program is: early STEM education, focusing on entering university, support during university, increase in STEM graduates, and support in STEM graduates as well. These are just some little programs. As David mentioned, we're very broad in scope. Land-based learning programs. We have a pre-collegiate program with universities where we take students that are in university and college, and around July, we have basically them tour the urban centers in Halifax and this colleges, but we also have them tour the community supports, more specifically for Indigenous students that come to the cities. We have an oceans program that's being developed. We have a backyard science program what we call Backyard Science, which was our science innovation program that we delivered, and then COVID hit, and we had to come up with something that was that would continue to develop the students. So we came up with this program called Backyard Science. And basically, literally, it is where students can learn about science from literally from their backyards. So this was a reaction to when the communities were basically on lockdown. So we had an example, Pictou Landing and Eskasoni First Nations, who literally locked down their community, so no one could go in and out of their community. So we had to make sure that kids were still learning, and this was what developed. We have project-based science, which I'm proud as an Indigenous-led organization to have actually 5 engineers on staff. We have a PEng and 4 engineers in training, and 4 of those engineers are actually 4 engineers in training are actually two are Indigenous, which I'm very proud of to have. And what they do is basically they create a project and work through to the final stages, and when they have a final product, they then develop the curriculum around it, and then they take those projects into the schools where kids actually see how they can develop a wind turbine, for example, or how they can develop a robotic arm that the Canadian Space Agency uses out in, and NASA uses. We created maker spaces before COVID. 13 communities, and right now we have a partnership with University of New Brunswick and the Joint Economic Development Initiative out of New Brunswick, where we're building 2 mobile STEM units. And that's really lessons learned, right? We had maker spaces. We didn't access as many First Nation Indigenous students as we thought we would. There's a lot of satellite communities within the Canada. So our mobile STEM units are basically going out to the communities and going where the students are and where the communities are, and bringing students even in those spaces like in the middle of the woods or on a beach and study science there, but also bring the Indigenous component with them as well. And that's being developed today with the community as well. These are just basically, like I said, delivery. There's a robotic arm. We had a great relationship with the Canadian Space Agency there. The students developed an underwater robotic ROV as well. These are just communities. It's this underwater ROV. They work with our Indigenous entrepreneurs who are out in the oceans as well, and work with our fishery experts as well as part of this delivery, and get the expert knowledge from our Indigenous people in these sectors as well. So we try and identify those people up front. This is one of the community gardens here. So under our community garden and food security initiative, we were fortunate to have a partnership with the United Way out in Atlantic Canada, and they funded the building of 6 greenhouses. And what we did there was actually I kind of handpicked the communities that we would build them, and they were in various different levels from the networks that they currently had, the philanthropic support that they had around each community, the location. River Bar has one which is very north of New Brunswick, so you're dealing with maybe 2 months of summer there. Meowbugeg out in Newfoundland, where you're dealing with soil that's arsenic. How does the community approach it? We have a community in Annapolis Valley, which actually owns its own farm that it purchased from a family that acquired it during the land grants back in the 1700s, and that's called Webster Farms. And Lennox Island and PEI, again, different environment, different supports. They have their own food initiative as well there. And so how I view them is basically we've created classrooms, agricultural classrooms, and it allows us a safe space to bring students into those greenhouses and elders into those greenhouses as well, and basically have a discussion about this ancient knowledge that's out there that Shaun mentioned, that hasn't grown necessarily automatically come out of the elders, because they haven't been in situations where that language has been discussed. So now we've presented them with these spaces, and the information just flows out of them. Once they'll tell their stories about picking blueberries in Maine, to picking mayflowers with their grandmothers, stuff like that. So we talk about food sovereignty in those spaces as well. And COVID gave us a great example of the level of food sovereignty we don't have. And so this gives us a discussion point to have these discussions with communities on how we can build food sovereignty and what that actually looks like. We're still in kind of learning stages with the greenhouses now, where we're looking at how do we build supports for them at a very broad level, and how do we help them with research and the best foods, and enable them to properly feed their communities, but also educate our communities in healthy living and healthy foods, right? To decrease our obesity rates, our diabetes rates, and just introduce our kids to those healthy foods. That's been our goal there. Just before I go into that, one of the things that we did do was we actually partnered with the Dalhousie Agriculture Program as well. So they have a ag program, a 2-year ag program, I think. And so we worked out a license agreement with that. And so Ulnooweg Education Center actually delivers that ag program out into the communities. So last year, I think we had about 100 participants, and this could be just the average person who wants to start a little garden in on their patio, to someone managing a greenhouse. And we actually renewed that this year, and delivering that on our learning management system. We've also worked with a community like Lennox Island, where the youth are involved this year in a youth farmers market. So not only are they learning about agriculture, but they're also learning about financial literacy and how to operate as an entrepreneur in those spaces. In terms of just having fun with food, we partnered with an Indigenous chef, a very well-known chef, Ray Bear, who owned a restaurant in Halifax, now owns a farm. But Chef Ray Bear basically took the kids into how to prepare food and actual science behind the preparation of food, and then they served it to the elders in the community of Millbrook. So we tie in the values of Indigenous people, our communities, the protocols of elders, and the science behind the food that we eat as well. And I think that one was they were served moose, but they were also served, I think, like seaweed, and how to prepare seaweed and all that stuff. So those are the things we do in an agricultural space. Oceans curriculum, like I said, we're just developing. We have a partnership again with Dell on eelgrass restoration. There's another project we're looking at the biomass that's created in the oceans, and how that can be used better. I mentioned our STEM pre-collegiate prep program there. There's a little math with Dash, how we try and teach kids in math in very early P to 6 levels. And here's one of our maker spaces, Edelgissi out in PEI, where David actually helped us in securing a touch tank, where kids actually get to touch the starfishes and the oysters and all that stuff. And that's an office, I think, of the tribal council out in PEI. And I guess overall, I usually take a break on Indigenous Day and go around with my kit while he goes around and does his traditional dances. But this year, I was fortunate to present at the Atlantic Economic Forum, and just talking about how we deal with partnerships. And as an organization at Ulnooweg, we do a lot of facilitating. And when the private sector or even government, but private sector approaches us as an organization where you haven't approached an Indigenous community before, we can take you through that process easily. You know, we really encourage the openness of an organization to actually go and introduce themselves to our organizations like us, and we can provide you with guidance in those ways as well. I think I'll stop there, Dave. Stop sharing.
Thanks for that, Chris. That was fascinating. It's always nice to learn.
That was very informative as well. So thanks, Chris, and thanks, Shaun. We did have one question. Shaun, you answered it in real time. Basically, it was a question around how you mentioned companies looking at reconciliation and to look at their history. The question was about, you know, what do new companies do, or startups, or people who don't have that history. And you know, I like within your answer that you know, looking at the sector as well as engaging with Indigenous organizations and communities. You know, that seems to be a good place to start, I think, for folks. And you know, if you want to elaborate on that, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think if whether new or old, I think if you start to look at whatever you do, whoever you work with, for your networks, your stakeholders, where you spend your money in events, knowledge, sponsorships, your products, your services, your knowledge offerings, whatever those things might be for your company, think of four things. Is it inclusive? Is it accessible? Is it culturally aware and sensitive? And is it responsive to the needs, challenges, and aspirations of our Indigenous communities when it comes to ag and food? Because it could be a lot of things. A lot of our communities are going to play leapfrog, not catch up. Yes, we want to farm our land or start something. We've got to claw back leases, particularly in the West. That might take some time. But we know from our other sectors that, you know, we own pipelines now. We own processing. You know, like, we're not going to, like, our communities are not going to just sit and farm. They're going to go right from farming to say, how do we package that? How do we process it? Where can we send that? How do we vertically integrate that? So for the folks online, think about those things for what you're up to. Indigenous people are great partners, and they're going to be better partners moving to the future as more things come online for our communities. And like I said earlier, if we keep that toolbox open, who knows what's going to happen? And a lot of that happens through partnerships. And it's not just Indigenous on one side and non-Indigenous on another. Some of the best partnerships and consulting companies and whatever you want to say, they come from partnerships with people from a diversity of backgrounds. And, you know, I would take the time to do some Indigenous awareness training. This, you know, today was a great start. There's lots of stuff free online. The kind of 101 training that our company used, 4 Seasons of Reconciliation, through the First Nations University of Canada. That's available at the Business Development Bank of Canada for free. University of Alberta has a great 20-hour course that you can either do for free or pay at different scales to be certified. But take the time to learn about, you know, our Indigenous people in Canada and our experiences. As Chris mentioned, yesterday was a day where, you know, myself and my team were out celebrating and participating some of the day. We spent part of the day volunteering to, you know, cook and serve meals at Friendship Center and celebrate there with their round dance, powwow, and stuff like that. So it's about engaging the community. You got to take the time and reach out. All of our events across Canada, all of them are all like powwows and round dance, all those kind of things. They're you don't need permission to come. You're welcomed into the community. We want to see you there. You'll be treated great. You'll enjoy all sorts of great food, and our announcers are great. They're humorous, and they offer teachings all day on the mic at a powwow and things like that. So don't be afraid to go out and experience, what's across the street or the highway or down the road when it comes to Indigenous celebrations and activities. So.
Thanks, Shaun. I think that's a great point. I think there's a lot of people who are a little weary of taking an incorrect first step for things like that. So I think knowing that, a lot of these celebrations are open to the public for, get out there, learn about the communities and the culture, and kind of take that first step towards growing it into something more.
And can I just make one more point?
Yeah.
I've seen in different companies as people take Indigenous awareness training, they get more terrified. Now they're really worried about making a misstep. I will suggest to you, try to fight down that feeling. I know what it feels like to be uncertain, and the more you know, the more you think you might mess up. Don't. Our communities have been waiting to be engaged and talk to you and talk about business and how to partner since the signing of treaty. You'll be welcome generally. You're not too many angry Indigenous people out there when it comes to business and reconciliation. So don't worry, there aren't dumb questions. It's silly if you don't ask and if you don't try to figure things out. Any Indigenous person, Chris, myself, and otherwise, if you ask them an open, honest question, well-intentioned, everything will be fine. I have friends and colleagues that are terrified to ask a question because will this be offensive? Am I using the right word? I spend a lot of time coaching people on that. Just don't worry about it. Just give her and it'll work out.
That's some great advice, Shaun. I think that'll go a long way. We've got one more question here from Kathleen at Dalhousie. She's wondering about what might be some of the most fruitful ways for engaging Indigenous youth in sustainable diet projects, including food production, value addition, and healthy food consumption.
Chris, you got some stuff going on in your communities there. Maybe you can share your thoughts.
Yeah, is it Kathleen? Did you say David? I guess a great example there, Kathleen, would be what as an example what we did with Chef Ray Baron, and it was just getting the kids out there with Chef Ray and teaching them about food and the science behind how to cook food and the processes and stuff. And but also sharing our values as an Indigenous person, the values of what it means to for the moose to sacrifice themselves and their spirit to us as well, right? So there's ability there where they're learning about the importance of those values there, but also learning about the importance of what actually healthy food means. Right, and healthy foods lead to clarity of the mind, which leads to better improvements in education and all that stuff. Right, so I use that as a great example. The other is working with elders. When you really focus on elders and trying to bring youth together. The community will respond very well to that as well, because you're feeding the knowledge keepers, but you're also feeding the transition of knowledge to the next generation as well. And you're doing it with food, and everybody loves to eat, right? But you're doing it in a way that those kids will learn about healthy diets, and it's just more impactful.
That's great, Chris. I've got one question, kind of, I think it could apply. I'm interested in hearing your perspectives from each of you. Based on the comments and the information you provided today, would it be fair to say that, for economic reconciliation, it doesn't need to be sector or industry focused, but more focused on what the action is and how it fits the needs of Indigenous communities and organizations? Like I know for us working in the plant-based agriculture sector, everyone's mind automatically goes towards, okay, how do we engage and partner with First Nations and work on economic reconciliation in the plant-based sector. But is that industry and sector aspect really important to taking the approach, or is it more focused on taking tangible action just in general?
I might offer, the former tangible action in general is a good place to start, because you can't be prescriptive. You have to really get to know the community that you're trying to work with. We can say, is this Canada, or are you operating in a town, in a region, and it's limited? Like that looks different from everybody. But you do start somewhere, and economic reconciliation is informed by all of the knowledge and awareness and the truth on the front end that you can then turn into action, right? So you might have heard the term reconciliation. It's really about, the truth telling and awareness, and then you can move to what that looks like for you and your company. And don't, it's maybe not at the company level for a lot of people, or you're not able to do something at that particular time, but the kitchen table is a great place to start. The water cooler at the office, having discussions and taking opportunity to learn. And then I don't know, maybe Chris, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would start definitely with the kind of the taking action in general. One thing that I like the term truth telling too. It's when you're just entering these relationships, you're going through this process, as Shaun laid out many examples of cultural diversity training, stuff like that. But one of the best training that you'll get is actually meeting the people in the communities that you're dealing with, right? Because none of these things can really paint us with the same brush, and everything in our protocols are sometimes very regional specific. So until you actually meet and go out with the people, you won't start building those relationships. So a general approach is what I would kind of recommend at the start. And it's one thing too, when you're sector based, that's where your expertise lie, and your lived experience guides you into thinking, okay, if I do step A, I'm going to get to step Z or whatever. And your assumptions are based on your lived experience. You have to understand that we don't have those same lived experiences, right? So your assumptions from even A to B and C will not be the same, and that's where that taking action in general has to be about learning what gaps are there in those processes from A to C that exist in the communities that you haven't experienced yourself, either going through the education system or going through your employment journey. So that's where you'll learn a lot, and just meeting people and their experiences, maybe even finding an Indigenous person in your sector is also a great thing to do, and to learn from their experiences, so that you initially get a better handle on what that looks like going into the communities.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Shaun. We're running a few minutes over. And I know Shaun has something else to get to right away. So this concludes our webinar. I'd like to thank Shaun Soonias and Chris Googoo for being our speakers at the webinar and providing their insight and information on economic reconciliation, as well as what their respective organizations are doing. I think there's been a couple of questions about getting slides, and I'll follow up with you guys on that after, about what you're comfortable sharing. But other than that, I'd just like to say thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, and take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. We'll maybe see you next week. So in Halifax, or can do.
Hopefully the weather's nice for you, Shaun.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.